The name should not have been spoken, and when it was, it tore through the assembly like a blade drawn where no weapon was permitted. Elspeth Vale stood near the outer wall of Hawthorne House, exactly where she had learned to exist, not hidden yet never visible, her presence tolerated only because it had become habitual, a shadow mistaken for architecture, and she was counting breaths as she always did when the room filled with voices that were not meant for her, when the Duke's voice cut across the polished murmur with deliberate calm and said her name aloud, clearly, unmistakably, without apology, and the sound of it struck her so sharply that for a moment she could not move. The assembly stilled, chairs creaked, heads turned. Her name, unused, unclaimed, fell into the space between chandeliers and marble as if it had been waiting years for permission to exist, and Elspeth felt the old instinct surge to lower her gaze, to step back, to become smaller than the moment demanded. But there was nowhere left to retreat. He had spoken it before the entire assembly, before men and women who had passed her for years without seeing her, before those who had learned her absence better than her presence, and the Duke of Ashcombe did not look away after saying it. He held the silence, allowed it to gather weight, and in that held breath, Elspeth understood that something irreversible had been done. She had survived by being forgotten. That had been the rule she learned early, the discipline she refined through careful movement and fewer words than necessary, through the art of not hoping and the safety of never being chosen. Forgotten meant untouched by curiosity, spared from judgment, permitted to exist at the edges where notice did not linger. It was a fragile mercy, but it had kept her intact. Now it was gone. The murmurs began, cautious at first, then bolder, curiosity rippling outward, as if her name had granted them permission to assign her meaning. Elspeth lifted her chin because the alternative was collapse, and collapse would be spectacle. She did not look at the Duke, though she could feel the attention he held on her like a tether drawn tight. Her pulse roared in her ears, memory colliding with the present in unwelcome fragments. A younger self learning silence, a promise implied and never spoken, the moment she understood that being set aside could be done gently and still destroy you. She had not prepared for this, for the violence of recognition, for the way being named could feel like exposure rather than rescue. The Duke waited. He did not soften the moment or explain it away. His expression remained controlled, aristocratic restraint masking something Elspeth refused to interpret. Whatever this was, it was not an accident, and that knowledge steadied her even as fear pressed close. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward into the space his voice had carved open, into the attention she had spent years avoiding, and felt the assembly adjust around her as if the world itself were rebalancing. She did not know why he had done it. She did not know what would follow. But as she stood there, fully seen at last, Elspeth understood one undeniable truth. She could no longer survive by disappearing. Elspeth did not sleep that night, though the house eventually surrendered to silence around her, the corridors dimmed, and even the servants' careful movements faded into rest. She lay awake listening to the old sounds she knew by heart, the settling of stone, the distant groan of wood contracting, the measured ticking of a clock that had outlived generations, and felt as though the walls themselves were waiting for something to crack. Being forgotten had always come with a peculiar mercy. It asked nothing of her. It required no explanation, no defense, no performance. She rose early as she always did, dressed in the same restrained palette she favored, careful not to invite attention, and moved through the house by instinct alone, her body following paths memory had worn smooth long before the Duke ever spoke her name aloud. Her life had narrowed gradually, not through any single cruelty, but through the quiet accumulation of omission, invitations never extended, conversations politely redirected, decisions made in rooms where her presence was neither requested nor acknowledged. She learned early that survival depended on anticipating exclusion and removing herself before it arrived. Dependence was a dangerous condition, and hope was worse. She cultivated usefulness without visibility, obedience without closeness, and the discipline of expecting nothing more than shelter and routine. It was not happiness, but it was stability, and she had learned to value stability above all else. The Duke of Ashcombe had once been central to her understanding of the world, though she rarely allowed herself to think of it now. Memory had become something she rationed. She remembered him not as he was now, all-controlled authority and public certainty, but as a presence that once felt inevitable, a gravity she did not yet know how to resist. When circumstances shifted, when whispers hardened into judgment, it had been easier for him to let her fade than to stand against the machinery of reputation. He had not pushed her away. He had simply stopped reaching. That absence, delivered without cruelty, had taught her its own lesson. Silence could erase you just as thoroughly as rejection. Now silence had been broken, and with it the careful architecture of her life. Elspeth moved through the morning aware of eyes following her where none had before. Servants hesitated, unsure whether acknowledgement was now required. Even kindness felt dangerous, heavy with interpretation. She kept her expression neutral, her movements precise, refusing to betray the tightness coiled beneath her ribs. Fear had returned, not wild or panicked, but sharp and alert, the kind that calculated risk in every glance. She did not seek the Duke. Whatever explanation he might offer would come when he chose, not when she asked, and she would not beg for clarity she had learned to live without. If he had decided to alter the rules of her existence, she would not meet that change with collapse. By midday, resignation hardened into resolve. She would endure being seen as she had endured being ignored. If anonymity was no longer hers, then dignity would have to suffice. The Duke of Ashcombe observed Elspeth from a distance he had mastered long ago, the kind of distance that allowed him to see without being seen, to measure consequence before action, to remain composed while the world rearranged itself around his decisions. He stood at the tall windows of his study, hands clasped behind his back, watching the inner court below where servants crossed with deliberate efficiency, and where Elspeth moved among them with the same contained precision she had always possessed. Nothing about her posture suggested panic. Nothing about her expression asked for mercy. That, more than anything, unsettled him. He had not expected gratitude, but he had anticipated reaction. Instead, she carried herself as though being named had merely altered the weather, not the shape of her life. He remembered too clearly the moment he had chosen silence years ago, not because he believed it just, but because it had been easier to survive than to resist. Reputation was a structure as fragile as glass, and twice as sharp when it shattered, and he had been raised to understand that power did not forgive recklessness. At the time, allowing Elspeth to fade had seemed the lesser cruelty. He told himself she would recover, that obscurity was safer than scandal, that distance could be temporary. Temporary, however, had stretched into years, and the habit of not reaching had hardened into a rule he rarely examined, until the assembly, until he saw her standing where she had always stood, unnoticed, and realized that forgetting her had required effort he could no longer justify. Speaking her name had been an act of control masquerading as confession. He had known precisely what it would cost her, how attention would close around her like a vice, how speculation would sharpen. He had also known what silence had already taken. Watching her now, he felt the uncomfortable truth settle with clarity. Elspeth had survived without him, but she had done so by becoming smaller than she should have been. That knowledge did not invite pity. It demanded responsibility. He did not approach her that morning. He understood that presence, like silence, could wound if delivered at the wrong moment. Instead, he watched how others responded, how uncertainty rippled outward from her sudden visibility, and how she met it without flinching. There was restraint in her movements that spoke of discipline learned through necessity, not comfort. The Duke felt a tightening behind his ribs. Not desire, not yet, but recognition. He had underestimated what she had become in his absence. For the first time since her name left his mouth, doubt pierced his composure. Restoration, he realized, was not as simple as acknowledgement. To be seen could be another form of violence if not accompanied by protection, and protection could become possession if he was not careful. He turned from the window with decision settling into place. Silence had ended. What followed would require more than restraint. The change did not arrive loudly, but Elspeth felt it everywhere, in the subtle recalibration of the house and in the way conversations bent around her presence as though uncertain which rules still applied. Where once she had passed unremarked, she was now met with pauses, glances that lingered too long, expressions caught between curiosity and caution. It was not kindness, nor cruelty, but something more precarious, interest. Interest demanded interpretation, and interpretation carried danger. Elspeth moved through Hawthorne House with heightened awareness, her senses attuned to the smallest shifts, her posture deliberately composed, refusing to betray the tightening beneath her calm. Whispers followed her like drafts through corridors, never loud enough to confront, never quiet enough to ignore. She heard fragments of speculation not meant for her ears, suggestions woven from ignorance and imagination, each attempting to assign her a place she had never been allowed to claim. Forgotten, she had been safe. Seen, she became a question others felt entitled to answer. The weight of that entitlement pressed against her ribs, reminding her how easily attention could turn cruel when novelty soured into judgment. She reminded herself that fear was information, not command, and she carried it carefully, as one might carry a blade she hoped never to use. The Duke's presence hovered at the edges of this new reality, felt rather than seen. Elspeth noticed how conversations softened when he entered a room, how those same voices sharpened once he departed. His name shielded him, hers exposed her. That imbalance was unmistakable, and she refused to pretend otherwise. Whatever his reasons, whatever remorse might have driven his announcement, she would not mistake visibility for protection. She had survived too long to indulge in such illusions. At a small gathering later that day, the scrutiny crystallized into something sharper. A comment, offered lightly, carried the unmistakable edge of challenge, testing how far courtesy would stretch now that her presence demanded acknowledgement. Elspeth met it with composure, answering only what was asked, refusing to justify herself. The silence that followed was not empty. It was measuring. When the Duke intervened, his voice was calm, authoritative, redirecting the moment without spectacle. The defense was precise, undeniable, and brief. It unsettled the room more than any display of temper could have. For Elspeth, the emotional turn came not with relief, but with clarity. Protection offered publicly could not erase vulnerability carried privately. The Duke had drawn her into notice. Now she would have to learn how to survive it. She felt fear sharpen into vigilance, a state she knew well, but this time it carried resolve rather than retreat. If the world insisted on seeing her, she would decide what it saw. The space between her and the Duke tightened, not with intimacy, but with consequence. Their connection, once defined by silence, was now defined by power, and Elspeth understood that navigating it would require more than endurance. The summons arrived with the formality of inevitability, delivered by a footman who avoided Elspeth's eyes, as though acknowledgement itself were now a complicated act. She accepted the message without comment, her fingers steady despite the slow tightening that settled in her chest. She had known this moment would come. Being named could not exist without consequence, and the Duke of Ashcombe did not alter the order of things without intent. Still, knowing did little to soften the weight of anticipation as she made her way toward his study, each step echoing with memory she had long disciplined herself not to revisit. The corridors felt longer than usual, the familiar portraits along the walls suddenly accusatory in their calm observation. Elspeth kept her pace measured, refusing the instinct to hurry or delay. Fear urged caution, anger urged confrontation, and she held both at bay through sheer will. She would not enter his presence diminished by expectation. Whatever he intended to say, she would meet it standing. The door was opened for her without ceremony, and she crossed the threshold alone, the space beyond charged with years of restraint. The Duke stood near the desk, not seated, his posture controlled, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Silence stretched between them, heavy not with absence, but with accumulation. Elspeth felt the old imbalance press close, the weight of his title, his authority, the room itself designed to reinforce it. She lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance, but in refusal to bow. She had learned too well what obedience cost when it was mistaken for safety. He began to speak, his tone formal, measured, explaining necessity, structure, propriety. The words flowed with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to command, but Elspeth heard what lay beneath them: correction, containment, order restored. When he finished, she did not respond immediately. She allowed the silence to return, deliberate now, her own assertion of space. When she spoke, her voice was calm, controlled, and unmistakably firm. She told him she had not asked to be remembered, that recognition offered without agency was merely another form of erasure, and that she would not accept gratitude as a substitute for explanation. The Duke listened, his composure tightening as each sentence stripped away assumptions he had not realized he carried. Elspeth named the cost of being forgotten without dramatization, without appeal. She did not accuse him of cruelty. She accused him of choosing convenience over courage, and that precision struck deeper than anger ever could. The emotional turn settled between them like a held breath. She was no longer asking to be seen. She was demanding clarity. When the meeting ended, nothing was resolved, yet everything had shifted. Elspeth left the study with her dignity intact, her resolve sharpened, Whatever came next would not be governed by pity or silence. If the Duke wished to alter her fate, he would have to face her fully, not as a shadow recalled, but as a woman unwilling to disappear again. The door closed behind Elspeth with a finality that lingered long after her footsteps faded down the corridor, and for a moment the Duke remained where he was, aware that something essential had shifted without yet knowing how to repair it. Their conversation replayed with unwelcome clarity, not her words alone but the restraint with which she had delivered them, each sentence precise enough to wound without spectacle. He had expected anger. He had been prepared for accusation. What unsettled him was her refusal to dramatize her suffering, as though pain long endured no longer required emphasis. That composure left no room for dismissal. They met again 2 days later, not by chance but by necessity, the matter of her future impossible to defer now that silence had been stripped of its authority. This time, the Duke did not begin with explanation. He waited, allowing the space to belong to her first, a deliberate reversal he was keenly aware of. Elspeth did not soften at the gesture. She spoke of the past without nostalgia, naming the bond they once shared not as romance, but as trust implied, and then quietly withdrawn. She described the moment she understood that she had been set aside, not through rejection, but through absence, and how that absence had shaped every careful choice since. The emotional turn arrived as she refused reconciliation without reckoning. She told him plainly that regret offered too late could not reclaim what silence had taken. The Duke listened without interruption, the discipline that had once allowed him to erase her now compelling him to remain still beneath her gaze. When he spoke, it was not to defend himself, but to acknowledge the truth she laid bare. He admitted that fear had governed him then, fear of scandal, fear of loss, fear of a power structure that demanded sacrifice without mercy. He did not excuse the choice. He named it. That honesty altered the air between them, not by healing the wound, but by exposing it fully to light. For Elspeth, the admission did not bring relief, but it did bring clarity. The past could no longer be misinterpreted as indifference or inevitability. It had been a choice, and choices carried weight. The relationship between them shifted into a space both raw and precarious, defined by proximity without comfort. They stood closer than they had in years, yet divided by consequence neither could undo. When they parted, there was no promise, no apology dressed as redemption. What remained was truth, spoken at last, and the knowledge that moving forward would require more than acknowledgement. The silence between them had ended. What followed would demand courage neither of them had yet fully claimed. Order, the Duke discovered, was far easier to restore on paper than in practice. The days following their second meeting settled into a strained equilibrium, one in which Elspeth's presence could no longer be ignored and yet could not be easily defined. Questions pressed from every direction, subtle inquiries disguised as courtesy, expectations forming without permission. It became clear that leaving her status unresolved invited speculation sharper than any announcement he might make, and so the Duke turned, as he had always done, to structure. Structure was predictable. Structure was safe. Or so he believed. He summoned Elspeth again, this time with a proposal prepared and formalized, a position within his household, clearly delineated, publicly respectable, shielded by protocol. It was framed as legitimacy, as protection, as a solution that would quiet rumor and provide her security. He spoke carefully, offering her role and recognition without scandal, emphasizing stability, continuity, and propriety. To him, it was an act of responsibility, a way to repair what had been broken without further disruption. He did not raise his voice. He did not command. He presented the offer as though reason alone could make it palatable. Elspeth heard the terms with stillness that masked the slow flare of insult beneath her composure. The words were generous in form and constricting in substance. Protection offered from above remained controlled by another name. The emotional turn came when she recognized the familiar shape of expectation returning, dressed now in courtesy rather than silence. Acceptance would grant her safety, yes, but at the cost of agency. Refusal would leave her exposed, a visible figure without shield or sanction. The choice was not between comfort and pride, but between survival and self-possession. She did not answer immediately. She asked questions instead, precise and measured, pressing at the boundaries of the role he proposed. Would her presence be obligatory or chosen? Would her voice be permitted or merely tolerated? Would her future remain subject to his discretion? Each question unsettled him, revealing assumptions he had not examined. He realized, with discomfort, how easily he had substituted structure for trust. When Elspeth finally spoke, her tone was calm, but the line she drew was unmistakable. She would not accept a position that rendered her visible yet voiceless. She would not be managed for the sake of convenience. If she were to remain within his household, it would be by consent, not obligation. The relationship shifted into forced proximity, not softened but sharpened, their paths now bound by necessity rather than affection. The Duke understood then that whatever arrangement followed would not restore the past. It would test whether something new, built on harder truth, could exist at all. Elspeth accepted the position the following morning, not because the terms had softened, but because she had examined the shape of refusal and found it more dangerous still. She did not mistake her decision for surrender. If anything, it felt like the first strategic choice she had made in years that belonged entirely to her. She presented herself in the Duke's study with the same composed restraint she had cultivated through necessity, but beneath it ran a steadier resolve than before. This acceptance, she understood, would place her squarely within view, but it would also anchor her presence where disappearance was no longer an option. She would no longer survive by shrinking. She would survive by standing. The Duke listened as she articulated her conditions, few in number but precise. Her role would not require her silence beyond discretion. Her movements would not be monitored beyond what courtesy demanded. Her future would not be subject to revocation without cause. Each stipulation was delivered without challenge, yet each carried the unmistakable weight of boundary. The emotional turn arrived when he agreed without negotiation. Something in his expression shifted then, not relief, but recognition. He understood that her acceptance was not compliance. It was intent. As word of her formal position spread, the house adjusted in small, telling ways. Doors that had once been passed without pause now opened deliberately. Servants acknowledged her presence with a care that bordered on uncertainty. Elspeth noted each change without allowing it to alter her bearing. She moved through her days with deliberate calm, learning the contours of her new visibility, refusing to perform gratitude for a role she had claimed on her own terms. Being seen still unsettled her, but it no longer felt like exposure alone. It felt like terrain she could learn. The Duke observed these changes quietly, measuring not the reactions of others, but her response to them. He saw how she neither flaunted nor concealed her position, how she met curiosity with composure and distance with dignity. It unsettled him in a way he had not anticipated. He had believed proximity would soothe the tension between them, that structure would contain what silence once suppressed. Instead, it sharpened awareness. He was forced to acknowledge her not as a dependent restored, but as a presence he could not shape to comfort himself. By evening, an unspoken understanding settled between them. They were bound now by circumstance, moving within the same space with heightened awareness, neither retreating nor advancing beyond what was necessary. The relationship did not soften, it steadied. Tension replaced distance, and in that tension lay the possibility of something neither of them yet dared to name. Elspeth's first public appearance beside the Duke arrived without ceremony, which only heightened its impact. She stood at his right during a modest gathering, neither announced nor hidden, her presence left to be interpreted by those who watched too closely. The room adjusted around her in subtle increments, conversations stalling, glances exchanged, judgments forming with the efficiency of long practice. She felt the weight of those assessments immediately, each one testing how she would carry herself now that her place could no longer be denied. The old instinct to withdraw stirred, but she resisted it, anchoring herself in stillness instead. Visibility, she reminded herself, did not require performance. The scrutiny sharpened as the evening progressed. Polite inquiries veered toward implication, curiosity edging dangerously close to challenge. Elspeth answered what was asked, and no more, refusing to offer explanation for a life that had never been granted context. Shame threatened briefly, a familiar pressure urging retreat, but it did not take hold. She had endured worse than speculation. She met each look with composed neutrality, allowing dignity to speak where defense might have betrayed uncertainty. The Duke observed from beside her, acutely aware of how quickly interest could sour into dismissal. He felt the tightening of restraint each time a comment brushed too close to insult, each time courtesy masked entitlement. When the moment finally came, when a remark crossed from curiosity into deliberate diminishment, he intervened without hesitation. His voice was calm, measured, but carried unmistakable authority. He corrected the speaker with precision, leaving no ambiguity about the boundaries he was willing to enforce. The room stilled, recalibrating once more, and the challenge dissolved into uneasy silence. For Elspeth, the emotional turn was not relief, but something quieter and more complex. The Duke's defense did not erase her vulnerability, but it clarified his intent. He had chosen to stand between her and humiliation without spectacle, without claiming credit. It was protection exercised with restraint rather than dominance, and she registered the difference immediately. Trust did not bloom fully formed, but its first fragile root took hold. As the gathering drew to a close, Elspeth realized she had not shrunk once. She had not apologized for her presence or softened herself to ease discomfort. The fear that had accompanied visibility was still there, but it no longer dictated her movement. The relationship between her and the Duke shifted subtly into alliance, not declared, but felt. They were no longer merely coexisting within the same space. They were navigating it together, cautiously, deliberately, aware that each public moment now carried consequence for them both. The challenge came 2 evenings later, sharper for having been delayed, delivered not in open insult, but in the polished cadence of a man accustomed to probing weakness without consequence. Lord Whitcomb, whose interest in hierarchy bordered on obsession, addressed Elspeth during a small reception with a smile that never reached his eyes. His words were phrased as inquiry, yet each syllable carried implication, questioning not only her place beside the Duke, but the legitimacy of her presence within the house itself. The room quieted instinctively, sensing the familiar thrill of sanctioned cruelty, the kind that passed for wit among those who believed status excused audacity. Elspeth felt the moment settle around her like a held breath. She recognized the shape of it immediately. This was the test that followed visibility, the invitation to falter, to justify, to retreat into apology. Her pulse quickened, but she did not allow it to reach her expression. She met Whitcomb's gaze evenly, refusing both defensiveness and submission. When she spoke, her response was brief, factual, and deliberately limited. She would not debate her right to exist. She would not offer history as explanation. The restraint unsettled him more than confrontation might have. Whitcomb pressed again, emboldened by the silence of the room, his tone sharpening as he attempted to draw blood through insinuation. Before Elspeth could reply, the Duke stepped forward. The shift was immediate and unmistakable. His voice cut cleanly through the space, calm but edged with authority that brooked no misunderstanding. He addressed Whitcomb directly, correcting not only the implication, but the presumption behind it. Elspeth's standing, he stated, was not a matter for speculation, and any further questioning would be interpreted as deliberate disrespect toward the household itself. The words landed with controlled force, leaving no path for retreat that did not resemble defeat. The room recalibrated. Whitcomb withdrew with a stiff bow, his advantage dissolved, the entertainment of humiliation denied. Conversations resumed cautiously, the earlier tension dispersing into subdued compliance. Elspeth remained still, aware of how close she had come to being diminished, and how decisively that outcome had been prevented. The emotional turn arrived slowly, not as triumph, but as steadiness. She had not been required to disappear. She had not been required to endure alone. As the evening waned, Elspeth understood that something foundational had shifted. The Duke's intervention had not been reactive or reluctant. It had been chosen, unequivocal, and public. For the first time, his protection was not conditional or subtle. It was claimed. Trust did not yet feel safe, but it felt possible. The relationship between them deepened by a single, essential measure. When challenged, he had not hesitated. And she, standing unbroken beside him, knew she would remember that moment long after the room forgot it. The days that followed settled into a pattern of careful proximity, one neither of them named but both acutely felt. Elspeth moved through Hawthorne House with a steadiness that surprised even herself, aware that each interaction now carried weight beyond habit. She no longer existed at the periphery, yet she refused to behave as though her presence required constant justification. That refusal became its own quiet declaration. She spoke when necessary, listened when it served her, and declined, with measured courtesy, any attempt to fold her into expectations she had not agreed to bear. In private, the dynamic between her and the Duke shifted with similar restraint. He did not summon her unnecessarily, nor did he offer explanations unasked. Instead, he watched how she occupied space, how she navigated attention without yielding to it, and how she maintained a distance that was not cold but deliberate. Elspeth noticed this change and responded in kind, neither withdrawing nor advancing, but asserting control through clarity. When boundaries were tested, she named them calmly, without apology. She would not accept protection that came tethered to possession, nor deference that masked obligation. The emotional turn lay in her recognition that she no longer feared his displeasure. That freedom altered everything. The Duke found himself unsettled by this new equilibrium. Authority had always answered to him without resistance, yet Elspeth's composure refused the familiar patterns of compliance. She did not challenge him for dominance, nor did she yield for safety. She simply existed on her own terms, and that autonomy demanded recalibration. For the first time, he was required to negotiate rather than command, to listen rather than assume. The shift was subtle but profound. Respect, once implicit in his title, had to be earned in her presence. A moment crystallized the change when a minor decision arose regarding her role, one he might previously have resolved unilaterally. Elspeth paused him with a quiet reminder that her consent mattered. The words were gentle, but they landed with undeniable force. He adjusted course without argument. That choice, small in form, carried significant weight. It signaled not concession, but recognition. By evening, an unspoken understanding had taken root. They were no longer bound solely by past harm or present necessity. Something steadier had begun to form between them, shaped not by apology or obligation, but by mutual acknowledgement. The relationship did not soften into ease, but it strengthened into balance. Elspeth recognized it with cautious satisfaction. Being seen no longer meant being shaped. It meant being met. The admission came without ceremony, offered not as absolution but as fact, and it altered the emotional terrain between them in a way Elspeth had not anticipated. They were alone in the Duke's study again, the room quiet except for the low murmur of rain against the windows. When he spoke of responsibility without defensiveness, he did not frame his words as explanation meant to soften consequence. He named his failure plainly, acknowledging that he had allowed fear to govern him when courage would have cost him far less than silence ultimately did. Reputation, inheritance, expectation, all the structures he had been raised to protect, had outweighed a human life standing quietly beside him. Saying it aloud stripped those justifications of their former authority. Elspeth listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, her attention fully present. The emotional turn did not arrive with anger, nor with the relief she had once imagined such honesty might bring. Instead, it came as clarity, sharp and steady. The truth did not heal the wound, but it defined it cleanly at last. She no longer had to wonder whether she had imagined the bond they once shared, or whether she had been foolish to believe it mattered. It had mattered. It simply had not mattered enough to outweigh fear at the time. She told him so calmly, without cruelty, and in doing so reclaimed something essential. Her pain was not an exaggeration, not a misunderstanding, not a failure of endurance. It was the natural consequence of being set aside. That recognition loosened the last grip of shame she had carried unknowingly. The weight she had assumed belonged to her alone shifted, settling where it belonged. The Duke received her words with stillness, the cost of acknowledgement evident in the restraint he maintained. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not imply entitlement to it. Instead, he accepted the discomfort of being seen clearly by the one person whose regard he had forfeited. That acceptance marked a turning point more significant than apology could have been. It demonstrated a willingness to remain present beneath judgment, rather than retreat behind authority. When the conversation ended, nothing felt resolved, yet something fundamental had changed. The space between them no longer carried the static of misinterpretation. Understanding had replaced speculation, and while forgiveness remained distant, it was no longer impossible. Emotional balance began to replace hierarchy, not through declaration, but through shared clarity. As Elspeth left the study, she realized that her sense of self had shifted irrevocably. She was no longer defined by abandonment, nor by proximity to power. She was defined by truth, spoken and received. Whatever unfolded next would do so on firmer ground, and that knowledge steadied her more than any promise ever could. The formal event was announced with little notice, as though urgency itself might blunt the significance of what it required from her. Elspeth received the information without comment, but the knowledge settled heavily, stirring a familiar tension beneath her calm. Appearances had always carried consequence, and this one would demand more than simple presence. She would be expected to stand beside the Duke in full view of a society that had only just begun to reassess her worth. There would be no hiding behind courtesy or obscurity. Whatever she projected would be accepted as truth. She prepared with deliberate care, not to impress, but to anchor herself. The gown she chose was restrained, elegant without excess, its simplicity a quiet refusal to perform. As she entered the hall at the Duke's side, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Attention gathered like pressure, measured and appraising. Elspeth felt the old flicker of anxiety threaten to rise, but she steadied it with breath and posture, reminding herself that she had survived worse than observation. She met the room as she was, not as it wished to define her. The Duke moved beside her with practiced ease, offering neither reassurance nor distance, allowing her to occupy the space fully on her own terms. That choice mattered. It placed responsibility for her presence not on his authority, but on her composure. As they navigated the evening, she spoke when addressed, listened when it served her, and declined to engage where curiosity tipped toward judgment. Slowly, the room adjusted. Admiration replaced uncertainty, not because she demanded it, but because she did not seek it. The emotional turn arrived quietly, without fanfare. Elspeth realized she was no longer bracing herself against humiliation. She was simply present. The absence of fear felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting, yet grounding. She recognized, with a measured sense of pride, that she was not surviving the moment, she was inhabiting it. The Duke observed the shift with an attention he did not attempt to disguise. Her poise unsettled assumptions he had not known he carried, revealing a strength forged independently of his influence. He understood then that whatever partnership the world perceived between them was not something he had granted. It was something she had claimed. By the end of the evening, they stood together not as protector and dependent, but as collaborators in a performance neither had scripted, yet both had chosen to sustain. Their relationship moved into practiced partnership, functional and composed, built not on affection declared, but on trust demonstrated. The night ended without incident, but its impact lingered. Elspeth left the hall aware that something irreversible had taken place. She had been seen and judged, and she had endured not by shrinking, but by standing fully in herself. Respect arrived without announcement, settling into the spaces where resistance had once lingered. Elspeth noticed it first in the smallest gestures, conversations that included her without hesitation, inquiries made without implication, glances that measured competence rather than curiosity. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, a recalibration of how she was regarded now that her composure had been witnessed rather than assumed. She did not mistake this change for affection. Respect was quieter than approval and far more durable, and she received it without altering her manner or softening her boundaries. The emotional turn unfolded gradually, as self-worth long held in reserve stirred back to life. Elspeth had learned to value usefulness because it justified her presence, but admiration rooted in character rather than convenience unsettled her more deeply. She found herself speaking with greater ease, offering insight without bracing for dismissal, and allowing her voice to carry where once she had restrained it. Each small assertion reinforced a truth she had rarely permitted herself to claim. She was not surviving by tolerance alone. She was contributing. The Duke observed these changes with a growing awareness that unsettled him more than opposition ever could have. Pride rose unexpectedly, not possessive or proprietary, but reflective, as though her success illuminated something he had nearly lost. He had believed strength was maintained through control, through careful limitation of exposure. Watching Elspeth thrive under scrutiny challenged that belief. Her resilience had not been bestowed by circumstance or proximity to power. It had been earned through endurance, refined through silence, and now revealed through choice. A moment crystallized the shift, when a senior member of the household sought Elspeth's counsel on a matter once reserved for those of recognized standing. The request was made naturally, without preface or apology. Elspeth responded with thoughtful clarity, offering perspective shaped by long observation rather than entitlement. The exchange passed without remark, yet its significance lingered. She had been consulted not as an extension of the Duke's authority, but as herself. The relationship between Elspeth and the Duke deepened through recognition rather than reliance. He no longer saw her resilience as something to be guarded, but as something to be honored. She, in turn, recognized that his attention had shifted from correction to regard. The power dynamic softened not through concession, but through mutual acknowledgement of capability. By the close of the day, Elspeth felt a steadiness she had not known before, a confidence rooted not in defiance, but in acceptance of her own worth. Being seen no longer felt like a threat. It felt like truth aligning at last with reality. The house had adjusted. So had she. And in that adjustment lay the quiet promise that the life she was building would not require her to disappear again. The threat returned not as rumor, but as intention, and Elspeth sensed it before it revealed itself fully, in the way conversations stilled too abruptly when she entered a room, and in the sudden caution that edged invitations once offered without hesitation. There was a difference between curiosity and calculation, and she recognized the latter immediately. The past, which she had believed finally laid to rest, had begun to stir again, disturbed by her visibility and by the shifting loyalties her presence had exposed. Whatever had once justified her erasure had not been forgotten by those who had benefited from it. The first sign arrived as a letter delivered without seal, its phrasing deliberately vague, its implication unmistakable. It warned of consequences without naming them, of truths that could still be shaped to wound if handled by the wrong hands. Elspeth read it once, then again, noting how carefully it avoided accusation while promising exposure. Fear rose instinctively, but it did not overwhelm her. The emotional turn came in the clarity that followed. She understood now that retreat would not spare her. Silence would only invite further pressure. The threat existed because she was visible, and visibility, once claimed, could not be relinquished without cost. She did not bring the letter to the Duke immediately. That choice was deliberate. She needed to understand her own resolve before allowing his concern to shape the response. When she finally did place it before him, her composure was unbroken. She did not ask for protection. She presented the reality of the situation and waited. The Duke's reaction was swift and restrained, his expression darkening as he read between the careful lines. The anger that surfaced was not explosive, but controlled, the kind forged through years of command. He recognized the origin of the threat at once, tied unmistakably to the circumstances that had once silenced him. The emotional shift for him was immediate and irrevocable. Where caution had once governed his decisions, something sharper took its place. He understood that neutrality was no longer an option. The forces that had profited from Elspeth's disappearance were now testing whether he would repeat the same failure under different conditions. He would not. For Elspeth, the threat clarified rather than destabilized. Fear remained, but it no longer dictated retreat. She refused to be maneuvered back into invisibility, refused to allow unnamed figures to reclaim power through intimidation. The relationship between her and the Duke tightened under pressure, shifting from tentative balance toward deliberate alignment. Protection, once offered cautiously, now sharpened into intent. By evening, both understood that the past had not finished asserting its claim. What lay ahead would require resolve rather than endurance, action rather than patience. Elspeth stood at the threshold of a choice she had never been permitted before, whether to be protected quietly or to stand openly against what sought to undo her. This time, she would not be decided for. The Duke did not attempt to disguise the shift in his approach after the threat revealed itself. Where restraint had once guided him, intention now did. He summoned Elspeth not to instruct her, but to speak plainly, and the difference was immediately apparent in the way he waited for her to take the chair opposite him before he began. There was no preamble, no attempt to soften the reality they faced. He acknowledged the danger without dramatization and, more importantly, without assumption. Protection, he said, would be offered, not imposed. The distinction mattered. Elspeth listened closely, measuring not his words, but the space he allowed her within them. When he spoke of safeguards, of limiting exposure, of strategies designed to contain risk, he did so as options rather than directives. The emotional turn arrived when she realized that for the first time, safety was not being framed as submission. She could accept support without surrendering agency. That recognition steadied something deep within her, easing the instinctive resistance she had carried for so long. She agreed to the measures that preserved her freedom while reducing vulnerability, declining those that felt too closely aligned with erasure. The Duke accepted her choices without protest. His willingness to adjust unsettled her more than command ever could have. It forced her to trust not the structure he offered, but the intent behind it. Trust, she understood, was not something granted all at once. It was built through repeated respect. As the days progressed, their coordination became quieter and more precise. Conversations shortened, expectations clarified, and unspoken understanding began to replace vigilance. Elspeth moved through the house aware of watchfulness that no longer felt intrusive. Protection existed, but it did not eclipse her presence. Instead, it reinforced it. The emotional turn for her was subtle but profound. Fear no longer occupied the center of her decisions. It informed them, but it did not command them. For the Duke, the change was equally significant. Offering protection without control required restraint of a different kind, one that demanded he trust her judgment as much as his own. He found, to his surprise, that doing so did not weaken his authority. It refined it. Power exercised with consent proved more durable than power enforced through silence. By the end of the week, a new equilibrium had taken hold. They moved together against a shared threat, not as benefactor and dependent, but as allies. The relationship shifted decisively toward partnership, defined not by hierarchy, but by alignment of purpose. Elspeth recognized the change with cautious acceptance. For the first time, she was not merely surviving danger. She was meeting it with support that did not require her to disappear. Elspeth discovered the evidence by accident, though she recognized immediately that nothing about its existence was accidental. It surfaced during an otherwise ordinary review of correspondence, tucked among documents that had not been meant for her eyes, but had passed through her hands all the same. The moment she read the first line, she understood its significance. Names, dates written in careful text, decisions recorded with cold precision, proof that the scandal which had once justified her erasure had been shaped deliberately, guided by interests that extended far beyond whispered rumor. More unsettling still was what the evidence implied. Revealed fully, it would not only clear her name beyond dispute, but fracture the Duke's standing, exposing how deeply he had been entangled in the machinery that sacrificed her. The emotional conflict struck with immediate force. Elspeth had imagined vindication countless times in the years she had spent forgotten, but this was not the triumph she had envisioned. The truth sat heavy in her hands, demanding a choice that felt sharper than any threat delivered by anonymous letter. She could release the evidence and reclaim everything that had been denied her, forcing the world to acknowledge the injustice done. Or she could remain silent once more, not from fear, but from consideration of the consequences that would fall elsewhere. She did not act immediately. Instead, she withdrew into stillness, examining her own motives with the same clarity she had once reserved for survival. Anger flared, as it was entitled to, but it did not dominate. What surprised her was the absence of desire for retaliation. She no longer needed ruin to affirm her worth. The emotional turn came quietly, in the recognition that her integrity had become something she would not compromise, even in the service of justice. When she brought the evidence to the Duke, she did so without accusation. She placed the documents before him and waited. His reaction was controlled, but the impact was unmistakable. He saw at once what it represented and what it could cost. For a moment, Elspeth saw the old fear surface in him, the instinct to contain, to manage fallout before truth. Then it passed. He did not ask her to conceal it. He did not suggest delay. He waited for her decision. Elspeth chose discretion, not silence born of submission, but restraint shaped by principle. She would not weaponize truth to reclaim power she no longer sought. The relationship shifted decisively in that moment. The Duke understood that her loyalty, freely given, carried far greater weight than obedience ever could. Trust deepened, not through declaration, but through sacrifice unrequested. As they parted, Elspeth felt a steadiness she had not known before. She had faced the truth and chosen herself without destroying another. Whatever came next, she would meet it whole, unburdened by the need to prove what she already knew. The retaliation came swiftly, as though discretion itself had been interpreted as weakness. Within days, the antagonist moved openly, no longer content with veiled pressure or anonymous warning. The moment was engineered with precision, timed to coincide with a gathering large enough to amplify humiliation and formal enough to legitimize it. Elspeth sensed the shift before it unfolded fully, the atmosphere tightening as she entered the room, conversations edging into strained politeness, eyes lingering with a calculation that carried intent. This was not curiosity. It was choreography. The accusation was delivered with the ease of someone accustomed to impunity, framed as concern rather than attack. A question posed aloud, innocuous in tone, carried an implication designed to fracture credibility without appearing overtly cruel. The room stilled in anticipation. Elspeth felt the familiar chill of recognition, the echo of a past where such moments had ended in her disappearance. Fear surged, sharp and immediate, but it did not root her to the floor. The emotional turn arrived as she chose presence over retreat, lifting her gaze and meeting the scrutiny without apology. She answered calmly, refusing to be drawn into defense. The restraint unsettled the speaker, who pressed harder, emboldened by the silence of the room. Each word was calculated to provoke a stumble, to force justification where none should be required. The cruelty lay not in volume, but in the expectation that she would bear it alone. This time, she did not. The Duke's restraint fractured audibly. He stepped forward before the challenge could deepen, his voice cutting through the tension with controlled force. There was no anger in his tone, only authority sharpened by intent. He named the maneuver for what it was, a deliberate attempt to discredit under the guise of propriety, and dismantled it with clarity that left no space for denial. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. He simply made it unmistakably clear that Elspeth was not unprotected, and that further provocation would be answered without patience. The room recalibrated instantly. The antagonist withdrew, advantage dissolved, the spectacle denied. What lingered was not scandal, but discomfort, the kind that followed when power revealed itself and found no compliance waiting. Elspeth remained standing, her composure intact, aware of how close she had come to standing alone once more, and how decisively that outcome had been prevented. The emotional shift settled slowly. For Elspeth, the Duke's intervention was no longer symbolic. It was alignment. He had chosen consequence over caution, risk over restraint. For the Duke, the moment marked a line crossed without regret. He had intervened not because duty demanded it, but because anything less would have been betrayal repeated. As the gathering resumed with forced normalcy, both understood that the conflict had escalated beyond whispers and maneuvering. The antagonist had revealed their hand, and with it, the truth that silence would no longer suffice. Whatever followed would require open confrontation, and neither of them would face it alone. The aftermath of the confrontation lingered long after the gathering dissolved, settling into Hawthorne House with a quiet intensity that neither Elspeth nor the Duke attempted to dispel. There were no immediate reprisals, no public declarations meant to cement what had occurred, yet the shift was undeniable. Servants moved with heightened attentiveness. Conversations softened when Elspeth passed, no longer sharpened by curiosity but tempered by awareness. The message had traveled quickly and without embellishment. She was not a figure to be tested lightly. For Elspeth, the emotional turn unfolded slowly, almost cautiously. Validation, when it finally arrives, does not always announce itself as relief. Instead, it unsettles the habits formed in its absence. She found herself recalibrating responses long governed by vigilance, learning how to stand without bracing for the next blow. The Duke's intervention had not erased vulnerability, but it had redefined the boundaries within which it existed. She was no longer navigating exposure alone. The Duke chose his next action with deliberate care. Rather than issuing a public rebuke or allowing rumor to shape interpretation, he asserted Elspeth's position in the only way that would endure. In a formal address to his household, he spoke of her presence not as charity or correction, but as necessity. She was integral to the functioning of the house, he said, her insight and steadiness valued without qualification. The statement was precise, unadorned, and unmistakable. It did not invite debate. It established fact. The emotional weight of that acknowledgement struck Elspeth more deeply than the defense that had preceded it. To be described as essential, rather than tolerated, reshaped something fundamental. She did not mistake it for dependence. The language he used left no implication that her worth derived from his authority. Instead, it recognized contribution freely offered and freely accepted. That distinction mattered. Privately, the space between them shifted again. Conversations shortened, not through distance, but through understanding. Where once caution had governed every exchange, trust began to surface in small, unspoken ways. The Duke no longer measured his words as carefully when speaking with her. Elspeth no longer guarded her responses with the same precision. Vulnerability edged closer, restrained but present, like a door left deliberately ajar. The relationship moved into implicit commitment, still unspoken, yet unmistakable. There were no confessions, no declarations shaped for reassurance. Instead, there was consistency. Presence chosen again and again. Alignment demonstrated through action rather than promise. As evening settled, Elspeth stood at one of the tall windows overlooking the grounds, aware of how far the ground beneath her had shifted. She had not asked to be defended. She had not demanded recognition. Yet both had been offered without condition. The realization steadied her. Whatever storms remained ahead, She would meet them from firmer ground than she had ever known. The quiet that followed felt deliberate, as though both of them understood that what had been spoken through action required no immediate articulation. Elspeth noticed the change first in the small, unremarked moments. The way the Duke waited when she paused mid-thought, the absence of correction in his silence, the ease with which shared space no longer demanded negotiation. Intimacy did not announce itself. It accumulated, subtle and restrained, in glances held a moment longer than necessary, and in conversations that drifted into reflection rather than strategy. They spoke less about the threat and more about the present, about the house, about matters once reserved for those assumed to belong. Elspeth found herself offering perspective without calculating its reception, surprised by how natural it felt to be heard without resistance. The emotional turn lay in vulnerability permitted without request. She did not brace herself before speaking. She did not soften her words to preserve harmony. The absence of consequence altered her posture from within. For the Duke, restraint took on a different shape. Desire, long disciplined into silence, surfaced not as urgency but as awareness. He recognized it in the way he registered her presence, even when she stood across the room, in the steadiness that replaced vigilance when she spoke. He did not reach for her. He did not name what stirred. Control, once enforced through distance, now manifested as patience. Whatever had begun between them would not be rushed into declaration or claimed through assumption. Evenings stretched into quiet companionship. They shared meals without performance, conversations meandering toward memory and then away again, neither pushing nor retreating. Elspeth sensed the boundary holding, firm but permeable, allowing closeness without demand. The emotional turn came when she realized she was no longer measuring how much of herself it was safe to reveal. The question had shifted from protection to readiness. The house seemed to recognize the change as well, settling into a rhythm that felt steadier, less charged. The threat remained, unresolved, but it no longer dominated every exchange. Fear had loosened its hold, replaced by anticipation neither of them acknowledged aloud. They existed within a pause, a deliberate slowing that honored what had been rebuilt rather than risking it through haste. One evening, as they stood together near the fire, the Duke spoke her name quietly, not to command or declare, but to draw her attention. The sound of it, spoken without audience, without weight of consequence, carried a different resonance entirely. Elspeth felt the significance settle gently rather than strike. Being named no longer felt like exposure. It felt like recognition freely given. The relationship deepened through patience, not avoidance. They allowed the space between them to remain charged yet unclaimed, understanding that what endured was rarely seized. In that restraint lay hope, cautious and unspoken, but undeniably present. Elspeth chose the moment with care, not because she feared his response, but because she refused to allow the question to be diluted by circumstance. It came on an evening when the house had settled into quiet, when the fire burned low and the sense of pause between them had grown almost tangible. She stood across from the Duke, her posture composed, her voice steady, and asked the question she had carried since the day her name was spoken aloud. She did not ask why the scandal had unfolded. She asked why, when it did, he had allowed her to vanish so completely. The emotional turn was immediate and forceful. The words landed not as accusation, but as demand, stripping away the last refuge of ambiguity. Elspeth did not raise her voice. She did not temper the truth with gentleness. She told him that understanding the mechanics of reputation was no longer sufficient. She needed to know the fear that had outweighed her existence, the calculation that had deemed her absence acceptable. The restraint she had practiced for years loosened, not into anger, but into clarity sharpened by long endurance. The Duke did not answer at once. Silence stretched, not evasive, but heavy with reckoning. When he spoke, he did not retreat behind explanation. He admitted that he had been afraid, not of her, but of losing control, of watching the structure of his life fracture under scrutiny. He had believed that preserving stability justified sacrifice, and he had convinced himself that her resilience would absorb the cost. Speaking it aloud stripped the justification of its remaining dignity. Fear, once named, sounded smaller than the damage it had caused. For Elspeth, the admission reframed pain without diminishing it. The emotional turn settled as understanding replaced doubt. She had not imagined her worth. She had not been mistaken in believing what they once shared mattered. It had mattered. It simply had not been enough at the time. That truth cut cleanly, leaving no room for blame to linger. The shame she had carried loosened its hold, replaced by a steadier awareness of where responsibility truly lay. She told him that fear explained his choice, but it did not excuse it. Forgiveness, if it came, would not be offered to soothe regret. It would arrive only if trust could be rebuilt without coercion or haste. The Duke received her words without defense, the cost of accountability evident in the stillness he maintained. He did not ask for absolution. He did not attempt to soften consequence. He accepted that this reckoning marked a turning point from which there could be no retreat into silence. When the conversation ended, both understood that something essential had shifted. The truth had been named, not to reopen wounds, but to prevent them from festering unseen. The relationship crossed from guarded proximity into honest terrain, uneven but real. Elspeth felt steadier than she had expected. The question had been asked. The answer, though painful, had freed her from wondering who she had been in his absence. Whatever came next would unfold without illusion, and that clarity felt like strength reclaimed. The truth, once spoken, did not demand immediate response, but it reshaped the space between them with quiet authority. Elspeth felt the shift not as relief, but as alignment, the kind that settles only after uncertainty has been stripped away. The Duke remained where he was, no longer guarded by composure alone, his restraint now serving a different purpose. He did not attempt to revisit his explanation or temper its impact. Instead, he allowed the weight of what had been revealed to stand unaltered. When he spoke again, it was not to revisit fear, but to name its consequence. He acknowledged that his silence had not merely removed her from danger, it had removed her from choice. He spoke of the ease with which power could justify itself, how stability became an excuse rather than a value, when it demanded sacrifice without consent. The emotional turn lay in the absence of self-pity. He did not cast himself as victim of circumstance. He accepted responsibility without seeking comfort in it. Elspeth listened with an attention that surprised her. Understanding did not erase pain, but it altered its shape. The anger she had carried no longer pressed against her ribs with the same urgency. In its place was something steadier, a recognition that the past had not been governed by inevitability, nor by her inadequacy, but by fear misapplied. That realization loosened the final knot of resentment, leaving space for something less sharp to emerge. She did not offer forgiveness. She did not need to. Instead, she named the boundary that would govern whatever followed. Trust, she said, would not be assumed or demanded. It would be built slowly, through consistency rather than confession. The Duke accepted this without protest. He understood that trust regained through patience would endure far longer than absolution granted in haste. The relationship moved into mutual understanding, no longer defined by silence or imbalance. Emotional equality began to take root, not through declaration, but through shared clarity. The power that had once distorted their connection softened into something more navigable. They stood on ground stripped of illusion, and though it was uneven, it was honest. As Elspeth left the room, she felt lighter than she had expected, not because the past had been redeemed, but because it no longer defined the limits of what she could claim. Forgiveness remained possible, but no longer necessary for her peace. She carried with her the quiet strength of knowing that her worth had never been diminished by abandonment. It had simply been unacknowledged. For the Duke, the moment marked a shift from regret to resolve. Accountability no longer felt like punishment, but like clarity earned. Whatever future he sought with Elspeth would be built without fear as its foundation. The silence that once governed his choices had ended. In its place stood intention, deliberate and unhidden, ready to be tested by what came next. The calm that followed did not signal safety. Elspeth sensed the change almost immediately, in the tightening of schedules, the sudden formality that edged communications once again, and the way certain names reappeared too often in conversation to be coincidence. The antagonist had not retreated after the failed public humiliation. Instead, they had adapted, recalibrating with the patience of someone accustomed to resistance. Pressure replaced spectacle. Where accusation had failed, coordination began. Rumors resurfaced, this time carefully laundered through respectable channels, stripped of overt malice and framed as concern for propriety. Invitations were delayed, meetings rescheduled without explanation. Elspeth recognized the pattern with grim clarity. This was isolation by refinement, the same strategy that had once erased her without leaving fingerprints. The emotional turn arrived not as fear, but as urgency. Silence would no longer suffice. Waiting would only allow the narrative to be rewritten without her consent. She brought her observations to the Duke without hesitation, laying out the pattern with precision born of long experience. There was no accusation in her tone, only assessment. The Duke listened intently, recognizing the maneuver for what it was, an attempt to fracture alignment by exhausting resolve. This time, he did not respond with caution. He responded with coordination. Together, they began to move deliberately, countering absence with presence and rumor with consistency. Elspeth appeared where she was expected to be excluded, spoke where silence was anticipated, and refused to allow hesitation to define her role. The Duke matched her visibility, ensuring that any attempt to sideline her required open defiance rather than quiet manipulation. The emotional shift lay in their unity. They were no longer reacting independently. They were strategizing together. The antagonist pressed harder, accelerating efforts to provoke a misstep. Information was leaked selectively, designed to test whether Elspeth would retreat under renewed scrutiny. She did not. The fear that once governed her responses had lost its authority. Courage replaced vigilance, not recklessly, but with intention. She understood now that being visible carried risk, but invisibility guaranteed defeat. The relationship solidified under pressure. Trust, once tentative, became operational. Decisions were shared rather than deferred. Each chose alignment again and again, not because it was comfortable, but because it was necessary. The Duke relinquished the last vestiges of unilateral control, recognizing that leadership exercised alone was vulnerable to manipulation. Elspeth, in turn, accepted the cost of visibility without resentment, claiming space she had once been denied. By the end of the week, it was clear to both that the conflict had entered a new phase. The antagonist's strategy depended on division and doubt. Neither was forthcoming. The ground beneath them was unstable, but they stood together upon it, no longer as protector and protected, but as partners confronting a threat that demanded honesty, courage, and shared resolve. Whatever followed would test that partnership fully, and neither stepped back. Elspeth made the decision before she announced it, knowing that once spoken aloud, it would alter the course of everything that followed. The choice did not come from impulse or defiance, but from a clarity earned through repetition. She had learned, painfully and thoroughly, that secrecy invited distortion, that absence allowed others to define you without resistance. If the antagonist's strategy depended on quiet erosion, then silence was no longer a shield. Visibility would have to become a weapon she wielded deliberately. She told the Duke without ceremony that she would no longer step aside to preserve ease. There would be no strategic withdrawal, no careful avoidance meant to soften tension. She would attend where she was expected not to, speak where hesitation had once been imposed, and allow her presence to be unmistakable. The emotional turn lay not in bravado, but in resolve. This was not exposure born of recklessness. It was choice. She was done allowing fear to determine the shape of her life. The Duke listened, his first instinct to protect surfacing before he restrained it. He saw the risks immediately, understood how quickly scrutiny could sharpen into threat. Yet he also recognized what Elspeth had already grasped. Containment would only repeat the past under a gentler name. To ask her to retreat now would be to deny the very agency they had fought to restore. Relinquishing control in this moment cost him more than any public concession had. It required trust not only in her judgment, but in her strength to withstand what followed. The emotional shift between them was decisive. Elspeth was no longer asking to be defended. She was asserting the right to stand openly, regardless of consequence. The Duke chose to follow her lead, not as concession, but as alignment. He would not manage her visibility. He would match it. The power dynamic altered fundamentally, equality forged through shared risk rather than declared intent. As Elspeth stepped into this new posture, she felt fear rise and then settle into something steadier. Courage, she understood, was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to be governed by it. Each appearance, each deliberate engagement, reinforced that truth. The whispers did not vanish, but they lost cohesion. There was no absence to exploit, no silence to weaponize. The antagonist responded predictably, pressing harder, escalating tactics in frustration. But the ground had shifted. Every move now required open confrontation rather than quiet manipulation. Elspeth welcomed that clarity. Better an adversary revealed than one operating unseen. By the close of the day, both understood the threshold they had crossed. There would be no return to caution disguised as safety. Whatever came next would unfold in full view, with consequences borne together. Elspeth felt something settle within her that had been missing for years, not safety, but ownership. She was no longer protecting herself from the world by shrinking away from it. She was meeting it, fully and without apology. The second assembly convened beneath the same vaulted ceiling that had once borne witness to her erasure, yet the air within it felt unmistakably altered. Elspeth recognized the symmetry immediately, not with dread, but with awareness sharpened by memory. Where she had once stood at the margins, unnamed and unseen, she now entered deliberately, her presence neither announced nor concealed. The murmurs that followed were restrained, cautious, no longer entitled to speculation, but unwilling to relinquish it entirely. Anticipation threaded through the room, not of spectacle, but of reckoning. She moved beside the Duke with composed assurance, aware of every gaze and untroubled by their weight. The emotional turn arrived quietly, in the absence of the fear she had expected to feel. The past no longer pressed against her ribs with the same insistence. She had walked into this space before as a shadow. Now she entered as herself, fully prepared to be seen. The contrast steadied her, rather than unsettled her. The Duke took his place without ceremony, his posture formal, his expression unreadable. Those who watched him searched for familiar signals of authority, for cues that might indicate how far defiance could stretch. He offered none. The silence that followed was deliberate, a pause that invited attention without demanding it. Elspeth felt the room hold its breath, waiting for instruction, for permission to interpret. The antagonist had positioned themselves carefully, confidence sharpened into calculation. They expected retreat, hesitation, or compromise. What they encountered instead was stillness. Elspeth did not look toward them. She did not prepare a defense. She stood, hands steady, gaze forward, refusing to frame herself as subject or spectacle. The emotional shift was palpable. Power wavered when denied response. As proceedings began, formalities unfolded with practiced efficiency, yet beneath them ran an undercurrent of tension that could not be ignored. Every motion felt weighted with consequence. Elspeth sensed the impending moment of challenge before it surfaced, recognizing the rhythm of confrontation from long familiarity. This time, however, she did not brace herself against it. She welcomed the clarity it would bring. The relationship between her and the Duke tightened not through touch or glance, but through alignment. They were poised not as protector and dependent, but as united presences prepared to meet whatever emerged. The choice she had made to stand openly now carried visible consequence. There was no space left for quiet erasure or polite dismissal. Whatever unfolded next would do so in full view. As the assembly progressed toward its inevitable turning point, Elspeth felt a calm resolve settle where dread once lived. She was no longer navigating this space in hope of survival alone. She was here to claim truth, to stand without apology, and to refuse the comfort of invisibility. The room had changed. She had changed, and whatever judgment awaited would be met, not with silence, but with presence deliberately chosen. The moment arrived without flourish, carried not by raised voices but by the quiet certainty of preparation fulfilled. As the proceedings reached their formal midpoint, the Duke rose, not to interrupt, but to introduce what had been deliberately withheld until now. His voice was steady, unadorned, and precise, and the effect was immediate. Attention sharpened. Elspeth felt the shift ripple outward, the room recalibrating as it sensed that this was no longer an exercise in ceremony, but in consequence. The evidence was presented without commentary. Documents were read aloud, names spoken clearly, actions recorded with the impersonal authority of fact. The accusations that had once justified Elspeth's disappearance unraveled under their own weight, exposed not as misunderstandings but as constructions shaped by interest and convenience. The emotional turn for Elspeth was not triumph. It was vindication stripped of spectacle. She felt no urge to react, no need to watch the room absorb what it had so long avoided acknowledging. Truth, once placed in the open, required no performance from her. The Duke did not speak for her. That restraint mattered. He allowed the evidence to stand on its own merit, refusing to frame it through protection or ownership. When glances turned toward Elspeth, searching for reaction, they found only composure. She did not claim victory. She claimed presence. The years of silence that had once diminished her now served as quiet proof of endurance rather than weakness. The antagonist attempted to respond, offering protest thinly disguised as clarification, but the authority they had relied upon had already begun to dissolve. Each objection sounded smaller than the last, stripped of context by the clarity of what had been revealed. The room shifted perceptibly, judgment giving way to reassessment. It was not forgiveness that emerged, but recognition, and recognition carried its own weight. For Elspeth, the emotional shift settled slowly, like breath returning after long restraint. She had not needed to argue her worth into existence. It had been acknowledged without demand. The fear that truth would cost her everything had proven unfounded. Instead, truth had stripped away what was false and left her standing. The relationship between her and the Duke moved into a new phase, defined not by defense, but by trust exercised publicly. He had placed the truth forward without attempting to control its outcome. She had accepted visibility without retreat. Power, once asymmetrical, began to level, not through concession, but through shared integrity. As the assembly absorbed the implications of what had been revealed, Elspeth felt an unfamiliar steadiness take hold. The narrative that had once defined her absence no longer existed to be feared or contested. It had been dismantled. Whatever judgments followed would be built on reality rather than rumor. She stood in the open, unhidden, unclaimed, and fully herself, knowing that this moment marked not an end, but a threshold crossed with dignity intact. The collapse of the antagonist's position did not arrive as spectacle, but as erosion, authority draining away with each unanswered question, and each sidelong glance exchanged among those who had once deferred without hesitation. Elspeth sensed it more than she saw it, the subtle withdrawal of confidence that followed exposure. Power that depended on silence rarely survived clarity. The room did not erupt. It settled, absorbing the implications with a quiet that felt heavier than outrage. What had been revealed could not be unseen, and no one rushed to defend what now appeared indefensible. The antagonist attempted to recover composure, offering measured responses that rang hollow against the documented truth. Their words carried the cadence of habit rather than conviction, and it showed. Allies hesitated. Familiar support failed to materialize. The machinery that had once protected them stalled, its mechanisms suddenly visible, and therefore vulnerable. Elspeth watched without satisfaction or malice. She felt no triumph in witnessing the fall. What she felt instead was release, as though a tension she had carried so long it had become invisible was finally loosening its grip. The emotional turn arrived in that release. Relief washed through her, not as exhilaration, but as quiet affirmation. She had not imagined the injustice. She had not exaggerated its cost. Seeing it acknowledged publicly did not restore what had been lost, but it returned something essential: legitimacy without qualification. The past no longer hovered as threat. It receded, stripped of power to dictate her present. The Duke remained beside her, his presence steady but unobtrusive. He did not intervene further, did not press the advantage or amplify the moment. His restraint reinforced what had already become clear. The truth did not belong to him to wield. It belonged to the room now, and to Elspeth most of all. The relationship between them deepened through shared restraint, an understanding that integrity required neither dominance nor display. As proceedings resumed with careful formality, the antagonist's influence continued to unravel. Invitations would be reconsidered, counsel withdrawn. What had once been certainty fractured into isolation. Elspeth understood the pattern well enough to recognize its finality. The same quiet mechanisms that had erased her were now reversing course. There was no satisfaction in that symmetry, only inevitability. When the assembly concluded, the atmosphere carried a different weight than when it had begun. Conversations resumed cautiously, tempered by awareness rather than entitlement. Elspeth felt eyes turn toward her with something new in them, not curiosity or judgment, but recognition edged with respect. She accepted it without altering her posture, unwilling to claim victory where endurance had been the truer measure. As she and the Duke left the hall together, Elspeth realized that the conflict which had defined so much of her silence had finally lost its hold. The antagonist's fall marked not an end, but a clearing. The space ahead was uncharted, but it was hers to enter without fear of being undone by the past. In the days that followed the assembly, a peculiar quiet settled between Elspeth and the Duke, not strained or uncertain, but deliberate. The urgency that had driven their movements gave way to stillness, as though the world itself were pausing to see what they would do with the ground newly cleared before them. Elspeth felt the change most acutely in the absence of pressure. For the first time since her name had been spoken aloud, no one demanded explanation, defense, or response. The space left behind was unfamiliar, almost disorienting, and it forced her to confront a question she had not yet allowed herself to ask. The Duke approached it first, not with assumption, but with restraint that carried unmistakable respect. He asked her what she wanted now, phrasing it carefully, without implication or expectation. There was no offer embedded in the question, no subtle claim of outcome. It was simply an invitation to define her future free from obligation. The emotional turn arrived in the quiet gravity of that moment. Choice, when finally offered without condition, can feel heavier than constraint. Elspeth did not answer immediately. She needed the silence to examine herself without the urgency of reaction. For years, survival had dictated her desires, narrowing them until they were indistinguishable from necessity. Now, with threat diminished and truth established, she found herself standing before possibility unshaped by fear. The realization unsettled her more deeply than danger ever had. Freedom required discernment, and discernment demanded honesty she had rarely been afforded. She spoke at last, not of outcome, but of need. She needed time unclaimed by expectation, space to understand who she was without the weight of erasure or defense. She did not promise return. She did not declare departure. She stated only that whatever came next would be chosen deliberately, not assumed. The Duke received her words without protest or persuasion. He did not attempt to negotiate the pause she requested. His acceptance was unadorned and immediate, and in that acceptance lay its significance. For Elspeth, the emotional shift was profound. She had been prepared to defend her need for distance. Instead, it was honored. The past no longer dictated urgency. The future did not demand certainty. She felt something loosen within her, a knot untied by trust freely given rather than extracted. As she stepped away that evening, not dramatically, not in flight, but with intention, Elspeth carried a steadiness she had not known before. She was not leaving to escape. She was leaving to listen to herself without interference. The relationship between them did not fracture under the weight of that choice. It held, suspended but intact, defined by respect rather than possession. Behind her, the Duke remained where he was, resisting the instinct to call her back or follow. He understood that what endured did so because it was not seized. The question he had asked her echoed now for them both, unanswered but no longer feared. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was finally hers to walk without shadow. Elspeth did not travel far, nor did she announce her intention to go. She chose a modest retreat beyond the estate grounds, a place quiet enough to allow thought to unfold without interruption, yet close enough that absence did not feel like exile. The distinction mattered. She was not disappearing. She was stepping aside by choice, and that difference reshaped every breath she took once the distance settled around her. The days that followed were spare and deliberate. Without the constant pressure of scrutiny or expectation, Elspeth found herself confronting habits formed in response to erasure rather than desire. She rose early out of instinct, not necessity. She measured her words even when no one required restraint. Survival had shaped her so thoroughly that stillness itself felt unfamiliar. The emotional turn emerged gradually as she recognized how much of her identity had been built in reaction to what had been denied her. To imagine herself without opposition required patience she had never practiced. She walked often, letting movement loosen thought, allowing memory to surface without judgment. She considered who she had been before silence taught her discipline, before usefulness replaced hope. That version of herself felt distant, yet not lost. Beneath endurance and composure, she discovered an inclination toward curiosity, toward quiet joy, found not in approval, but in attention freely given. The realization did not arrive as revelation. It settled as recognition, long overdue. Inevitably, her thoughts returned to the Duke, not with urgency, but with clarity. She considered the man he had been when fear governed him, and the man he was becoming through accountability. For the first time, she examined the connection between them without the distortion of imbalance. If she returned, it would not be because she needed shelter or recognition. It would be because she chose partnership, aware of both its promise and its cost. The emotional shift crystallized one afternoon as she paused beside a stream, watching water move without resistance, shaped not by force but by persistence. She understood then that love unchosen was burden, and love chosen freely was risk. She was no longer willing to accept one in place of the other. Whatever bond remained between her and the Duke would survive only if it could exist without dependence. By the end of the week, Elspeth felt steadier, not because every question had been answered, but because she had learned to tolerate uncertainty without retreat. She no longer needed distance to define herself. The space she had claimed had done its work. It had stripped away urgency and left intention in its place. When she finally turned back toward Hawthorne House, the decision did not feel dramatic. It felt precise. She was not returning to be claimed, restored, or secured. She was returning to offer choice where once there had been silence. The relationship, suspended but unbroken, awaited not rescue, but consent. And Elspeth, walking back on her own terms, knew that whatever followed would be shaped not by fear of loss, but by clarity hard-won. Elspeth returned without announcement, arriving at Hawthorne House as evening settled into the stone and the light softened along the corridors she knew so well. There was no sense of intrusion in her steps, no hesitation at the threshold. She had left with intention, and she returned with the same. The difference lay not in the distance traveled, but in the steadiness she carried now, an assurance rooted in choice rather than necessity. She did not come back to reclaim a place. She came back to define one. The Duke did not rush to meet her. That restraint mattered. When they finally stood together, it was in the quiet of the library, the space neutral and uncharged by memory. Elspeth spoke first, not to explain her absence, but to name its purpose. She told him she had returned because she wanted to, because the life she was shaping did not require withdrawal to feel whole. She would not be summoned. She would not be retained by obligation or gratitude. If she remained, it would be as an equal presence, free to leave again if she chose. The emotional turn arrived in the simplicity of his response. He accepted her terms without revision. There was no argument, no subtle attempt to anchor her more securely than she had offered. He acknowledged that whatever existed between them now could only endure if it was chosen repeatedly, not assumed. In doing so, he relinquished the last trace of authority he might have claimed over her future. The act was quiet, but its significance was unmistakable. For Elspeth, the release was profound. She had braced herself for negotiation, for persuasion disguised as reassurance. Instead, she was met with trust unqualified by expectation. The fear that choice would fracture what they had built proved unfounded. It strengthened it. She no longer needed to guard herself against being absorbed into someone else's design. Her presence was her own. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, unhurried and deliberate. Elspeth resumed her place within the household, without the weight of obligation pressing against her ribs. She spoke freely, moved without calculation, and allowed herself to inhabit space without apology. The Duke matched her posture, engaging without oversight, attentive without control. Their conversations deepened not through intensity, but through ease. The relationship evolved into partnership chosen rather than declared. There were no vows exchanged, no promises shaped for permanence. Instead, there was consistency. Each morning began with the quiet understanding that presence was offered, not owed. Each evening closed with the same. Elspeth felt the change most keenly in herself. She no longer measured her worth against absence or recognition. She measured it against alignment with her own clarity. Returning had not diminished her independence, it had affirmed it. As she stood one evening at the window overlooking the grounds, Elspeth understood that the most radical act she had committed was not standing in the assembly or confronting the past. It was choosing to stay without surrendering herself. Whatever came next would unfold from that truth, steady and unhidden. The Duke chose the moment with the same deliberation that had once governed his silence, but this time the intention ran in the opposite direction. It came during a formal gathering convened for matters of estate governance, a setting where authority was expected to move unchallenged and where decisions were often announced rather than discussed. Elspeth attended without anticipation, assuming nothing beyond observation. She stood among others accustomed to power being exercised without explanation, unaware that the structure she had learned to navigate was about to be altered in full view. When the Duke spoke, he did not begin with her name. He spoke instead of governance, of stewardship, of the difference between command and leadership. His words were measured, unmistakably his, yet something in their cadence signaled departure from habit. He addressed the matter of delegated authority, outlining changes that would distribute responsibility rather than consolidate it. The room listened with polite attention, expecting refinement, not revision. Then he named Elspeth, not as dependent, not as exception, but as equal voice within the decisions that shaped the household's future. The emotional turn was immediate and unmistakable. He did not frame the change as generosity or trust extended. He framed it as correction. He acknowledged, without apology or defensiveness, that authority exercised without consent had diminished those it sought to protect. In recognizing Elspeth publicly as autonomous and authoritative within her own sphere, he relinquished unilateral control not as concession, but as principle. The declaration did not elevate her above others. It removed her from beneath him. Elspeth felt the weight of the moment settle slowly, not as shock, but as recognition. This was not an act performed for her alone. It was a redefinition of how power would function in spaces that had once depended on silence and hierarchy. She did not respond immediately. She did not need to. The shift was not hers to justify. It had been claimed openly, without request. The reaction around them was restrained but telling. Surprise flickered. Discomfort followed. Some faces registered approval, others calculation. What did not appear was defiance. The Duke's authority had not diminished. It had transformed. By choosing vulnerability over dominance, he had altered the terms by which he was understood. For Elspeth, the emotional shift deepened into something steadier than validation. She recognized the cost of what he had done. Control relinquished publicly could not be reclaimed quietly. Whatever resistance followed would be faced without the refuge of command. That knowledge mattered. It demonstrated a commitment that extended beyond personal regard into principle lived. Afterward, when the room had emptied and formality dissolved into quiet, they did not speak of it immediately. Words would have been insufficient. The relationship between them had crossed into emotional equality, not through promise, but through action witnessed and recorded. He had stepped back without asking her to step forward. She had been acknowledged without being placed. Later that evening, Elspeth understood the significance with clarity that left no doubt. She was no longer navigating a space defined by permission. She was standing within one shaped by mutual recognition. The Duke had not offered her freedom. He had recognized it, and in doing so, he had changed not only how she was seen, but how he would be held accountable henceforth. The future remained unwritten, but it would not be governed by silence again. The days that followed did not announce themselves as resolution, yet they carried the unmistakable texture of peace earned rather than granted. Elspeth felt it in the absence of tension she had grown accustomed to measuring unconsciously, the quiet ease with which her presence no longer altered the rhythm of a room. Hawthorne House adjusted without spectacle, as institutions often do when change is inevitable. Conversations resumed without caution. Decisions unfolded without the need to calculate who might be diminished by them. The shift was subtle but pervasive, like a current changing direction beneath still water. Elspeth moved through her days without vigilance for the first time she could remember. She noticed how her shoulders no longer tightened at footsteps behind her, how her thoughts were no longer preoccupied with anticipating dismissal or correction. Peace, she discovered, was not an absence of challenge, but an absence of threat. The emotional turn settled gently, bringing with it a sense of belonging that did not demand proof. She spoke freely, offered perspective without bracing for consequence, and allowed herself moments of quiet satisfaction without immediately tempering them with caution. The Duke observed these changes with steady attention, aware that stability required maintenance rather than declaration. He did not seek recognition for the shift he had initiated, nor did he retreat from the responsibility it carried. Authority redistributed had a way of revealing weakness as readily as strength, and he accepted both as part of the recalibration. In relinquishing control, he had not surrendered leadership. He had refined it. The house functioned not because he commanded, but because those within it now trusted the structure to hold. Their relationship settled into a rhythm that required no negotiation. They shared meals without formality, discussions unfolding naturally rather than strategically. Elspeth noticed how often she laughed without checking herself, how easily conversation drifted into reflection rather than guarded exchange. The emotional shift lay not in heightened intensity, but in sustained calm. What had once felt fragile now felt durable, capable of withstanding silence without misinterpretation. Society, too, adjusted. Resistance softened into acceptance, and acceptance into quiet respect. Elspeth's standing no longer required defense. It existed as fact, reinforced by consistency rather than declaration. She encountered neither resentment nor reverence, only acknowledgement, which felt far rarer and more valuable than either extreme. The past receded into memory, no longer looming as threat or justification. One afternoon, as she walked the gardens in late light, Elspeth paused simply to be still. The impulse surprised her. She was not hiding, not waiting, not preparing. She was present. The realization settled with quiet certainty. She had survived the storm, but more importantly, she had outlived the need for it. The Duke joined her without announcement, their silence companionable rather than weighted. They stood together, not as figures shaped by conflict, but as people inhabiting the aftermath of courage. No words were required to affirm what had been built. Peace, she understood then, was not a reward. It was a condition created through choice, repeated and protected. As evening deepened, Elspeth felt the future open not as uncertainty to be feared, but as space to be entered deliberately. The life before her no longer required vigilance to endure. It required intention to sustain, and for the first time, she trusted herself fully to do so. The proposal did not arrive with ceremony or audience, and Elspeth would later understand that this was precisely why it mattered. It came on an evening shaped by quiet routine rather than anticipation, when the house had settled into its steady rhythm and the weight of recent change had softened into something livable. They sat together in the smaller drawing room, the fire low, the hour unremarkable, and it was there, within ordinariness, that the Duke spoke. He did not begin with declaration. He did not rise, did not frame his words for permanence or performance. He spoke as one might speak when no defense was required, acknowledging the path that had brought them to this moment without attempting to sanctify it. He told her that what they had built was not owed to circumstance or survival, but to choice, repeated and honored. He told her that he did not seek to complete her life or secure his own through her presence. He sought partnership, freely given, capable of refusal without consequence. The emotional turn arrived not in surprise, but in recognition. This was not rescue disguised as devotion, it was invitation. Elspeth listened without interruption, her attention steady, her heart unhurried. She felt no rush toward answer, no pressure to preserve what existed by agreeing too quickly. The freedom to refuse was evident in the space he left her, in the absence of urgency. She recognized that restraint as the truest measure of his intent. When she spoke, her voice was calm, carrying certainty rather than hesitation. She accepted, not because she feared losing what they had built, but because she understood its value. She accepted because she wished to choose him, not as protection or promise, but as companion. They did not seal the moment with spectacle. There was no ring offered, no vow spoken aloud beyond the commitment already named. The proposal was complete in its mutual clarity. The relationship shifted not through transformation, but through confirmation. What had been steady remained so, now anchored by shared intention rather than implication. In the days that followed, nothing outwardly changed. Elspeth noticed this with quiet satisfaction. She was not repositioned, renamed, or recast by the choice she had made. The Duke did not behave as though her consent had granted him claim. Instead, presence continued as before, shaped by respect rather than entitlement. The emotional shift lay in the absence of disruption. Love, she realized, did not require upheaval to be real. They spoke privately of the future without urgency, acknowledging practicalities without allowing them to dominate. Elspeth insisted that whatever acknowledgement came would be deliberate and honest, not softened for comfort. She would not be hidden again, not even gently. The Duke agreed without reservation. Visibility, once forced, would now be chosen. One evening, Elspeth stood alone in the corridor where she had once learned how to disappear. The memory felt distant, almost belonging to someone else. She placed her hand against the cool stone and felt nothing but grounding. The choice she had made had not erased her independence. It had affirmed it. When she turned back toward the life unfolding ahead, she did so without fear of being subsumed. She was not stepping into belonging at the cost of herself. She was stepping forward with herself intact. And that, more than the proposal itself, was the truest beginning of what they were becoming. Elspeth was the one who insisted on what came next, and she did so without hesitation or apology. The proposal had been private by design, shaped to honor choice rather than spectacle. But privacy, she understood, could too easily become another form of erasure if left unexamined. She had not fought her way into visibility only to accept a gentler version of concealment. If their commitment was to endure, it would do so in the open, not as performance, but as truth acknowledged without embarrassment. She told the Duke plainly that she would not belong to him quietly. There would be no softened announcement made on her behalf, no careful phrasing designed to shield others from discomfort. Her name would be spoken as his equal, her place affirmed without qualification. The emotional turn arrived in the steadiness of her conviction. This was not demand born of pride, but of memory. She had learned too well how easily silence could be mistaken for consent. The Duke listened, and where once caution might have guided his response, resolve answered instead. He agreed without reservation, understanding that visibility chosen carried a different weight than visibility imposed. He recognized that public acknowledgement was not about claiming her, but about honoring her refusal to be diminished again. Whatever discomfort the declaration might provoke would be borne openly, without mitigation. They chose the moment together, not for grandeur, but for clarity. It would be at a formal gathering already convened, where attendance signified accountability and words spoken could not be retracted into rumor. Elspeth prepared without anxiety, selecting attire that reflected neither retreat nor defiance. She did not dress to command attention, she dressed to occupy it comfortably. The distinction mattered. As they entered the hall side by side, the room adjusted instinctively, sensing significance without knowing its shape. Elspeth felt the familiar weight of attention settle around her, but it no longer pressed against her ribs with threat. She had claimed this space before. She knew how to stand within it now. The Duke's presence beside her was steady, not protective, not possessive. He did not guide her steps or signal reassurance. He allowed her to move as she chose. When the moment came, it unfolded simply. The Duke spoke her name clearly, without preamble or flourish, and named her as his chosen partner before those gathered. The words carried neither apology nor justification. They did not seek approval. They stated fact. The emotional shift rippled outward, surprise giving way to reassessment, then acceptance shaped by inevitability. This was not a correction to be debated. It was a truth declared. Elspeth met the room's attention without lowering her gaze. She did not smile for comfort or soften herself for ease. She stood in the full knowledge of what it had cost to arrive there and what it would require to remain. Pride settled within her, quiet and unshaken. She had not been presented. She had been acknowledged. As the gathering resumed, the significance lingered not in whispers, but in posture. Elspeth moved through the room without hesitation, neither elevated nor diminished by the declaration. She was simply present, fully, and without fear. The choice she had made had not bound her. It had freed her further. Later, when the night deepened and the house quieted once more, Elspeth reflected on the symmetry of it all. Her name, once spoken to shatter silence, had now been spoken to affirm truth. The difference lay not in who said it, but in who she had become, and in that recognition she felt no need to retreat ever again. The final assembly was larger than the others, drawn together not by curiosity alone, but by a shared understanding that something conclusive would take place. Hawthorne House stood illuminated against the evening sky, its great hall filled with voices that carried less entitlement than they once had. Elspeth felt the difference immediately. This was no longer a room waiting to pass judgment. It was a room prepared to witness. The distinction steadied her as she entered beside the Duke, her posture unguarded, her presence assured. The symmetry of the moment was impossible to ignore. It had been here, beneath these same arches, that her name had once torn through silence like a wound reopened. That day, she had stood exposed, uncertain, unprepared for the consequences of being seen. Now she stood fully aware of them, having chosen visibility with intention rather than necessity. Memory flickered, but it no longer held power. The past did not threaten to reclaim her. It merely reminded her of the distance she had traveled. When the Duke rose, the room quieted at once. He did not command attention. He received it. His voice carried without strain, shaped by certainty rather than authority. He spoke not of correction or restoration, but of acknowledgement, framing the moment not as an announcement meant to alter perception, but as a declaration meant to honor truth. Then he spoke her name. This time, it did not strike like a blade. It settled like recognition, long delayed but finally earned. He named her not as dependent, not as exception, not as figure restored from obscurity, but as his chosen partner, standing beside him by will rather than circumstance. The words carried no justification. They did not seek validation. They existed as fact. The emotional turn unfolded across the room with quiet inevitability. Surprise gave way to acceptance shaped by clarity. There was no spectacle to resist, no scandal to dissect. What remained was presence acknowledged and authority redefined. Elspeth felt the weight of every gaze upon her, but it no longer pressed against her ribs with threat. She met the attention evenly, her expression composed, her stance unyielding. In that moment, She understood the full measure of what had changed. She was no longer the woman who survived by remaining unnoticed. She was no longer the woman defined by absence or endurance alone. She was a woman who had chosen to be seen, who had faced consequence without retreat, and who now stood openly within a life she had claimed. As proceedings continued, Elspeth moved through the hall without hesitation. Conversations resumed around her, not with whispers, but with acknowledgement. She was addressed directly, without implication or caution. The house adjusted once more, not in reaction, but in recognition of permanence. This was not a moment that could be undone quietly. It would stand. Later, as the assembly dissolved into evening and the great doors opened onto the night, Elspeth paused at the threshold and looked back once. There was no longing in her gaze, no sense of unfinished reckoning. The past had been confronted fully. Nothing remained unspoken. When she turned forward again, it was with certainty that the name once meant to be forgotten now carried something far greater than recognition. It carried choice, dignity, and truth claimed openly. And in that truth, she stepped into what followed without fear, knowing she would never again be erased by silence. Life did not resolve itself into perfection after the final assembly, and Elspeth was quietly grateful for that. Perfection would have felt fragile, dependent on constant vigilance, but what unfolded instead was steadier, grounded in patterns that no longer required her to brace for disappearance. Hawthorne House settled into its rhythms with a sense of continuity that felt earned rather than imposed. Mornings arrived without urgency. Evenings closed without the residue of unspoken tension. The absence of fear did not feel like emptiness. It felt like space finally made usable. Elspeth moved through that space with a confidence that no longer needed to assert itself. She participated where she chose, withdrew when she wished, and found that neither action invited scrutiny. Her presence had become ordinary in the best possible way, neither exceptional nor contested. The emotional resolution lay in that ordinariness. To exist without explanation, without anticipation of loss, was a freedom she had once believed unattainable. She no longer measured herself against what might be taken away. She measured herself against alignment with her own clarity. The Duke, for his part, did not retreat into habit once the conflict ended. Accountability had altered him in ways he did not attempt to conceal. Authority exercised now was tempered by consultation, by awareness of consequence beyond convenience. He no longer mistook restraint for wisdom or silence for strength. Leadership, he had learned, endured only when it was visible and answerable. Elspeth saw this not in declarations, but in consistency, in choices made when no audience waited to approve them. Their relationship unfolded without urgency or display. There was affection, deepened by trust, and desire, shaped by patience rather than claim. They shared decisions without negotiation framed as concession. Disagreement existed, but it no longer carried threat. Elspeth understood now that love did not require her to soften her edges or diminish her independence. It existed alongside it, strengthened by the refusal to be anything other than fully herself. Sometimes, she returned in memory to the woman she had been when survival meant shrinking. She regarded that version of herself without judgment or regret. Endurance had carried her through what she could not yet change. Courage had carried her into what she finally could. The transition between the two felt seamless now, not because the past had been erased, but because it no longer governed her present. One evening, as the light faded across the grounds and the house grew quiet, Elspeth stood once more at the window, overlooking the path she had walked so many times unseen. The symmetry no longer held power over her. Names spoken or withheld no longer defined the limits of her life. What mattered was that she had claimed visibility without surrender, belonging without erasure. The story of her being forgotten had ended not with rescue, but with choice. She had been seen because she stood, named because she claimed her place, and loved because she refused to disappear. That was the truth that endured beyond assemblies and declarations. As night settled, Elspeth turned from the window without hesitation, carrying forward a life shaped not by what had once silenced her, but by what she had chosen to speak into existence. The future waited, not as promise or threat, but as continuation, and for the first time, that was more than enough.